It has not been a particularly easy road for The Last of Us Part 2, or its developer Naughty Dog. After near universal praise in 2013, The Last of Us followed this success with a humanizing add-on story in Left Behind, and then packaged it all together the following year under the remastered moniker, where it received even more accolades. 2 years later, Naughty Dog released Uncharted 4: A Thief's End, which went on to become a critical and financial success, and quite possibly the greatest send-off in video game history. I mean, come on. Pirates, betrayal, swashbuckling. Naughty Dog seemed incapable of doing any wrong. Then came the 2016 PlayStation Experience event. It was a show packed with great announcements. Akuma for Street Fighter V, Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, and Knack 2. Oh, baby, Jesus Christ, Knack 2. As big as that was, though, Sony still had one more announcement in store for us, and they closed the show with The Last of Us Part 2. It looked incredible, dripping with detail. Ellie and Joel were older, more cynical, more savage. The internet exploded. They finally had gotten their wish, a follow-up to the 2013 masterpiece that left us in such a frustrating way.
Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
But this is where the controversy started. A fair amount of people, myself included, were slightly upset at the announcement of a sequel. In an industry built on sequels, here was a near-perfect example of a big-budget game that told an isolated story that didn't need a follow-up. It was expertly crafted to be an intimate tale set in an unintimate world. By announcing a sequel, you all but ruin the impact of the original narrative. Now it doesn't feel as personal among a larger backdrop, and the beautiful ambiguity of it is soiled as we are forced to see what has happened following that sudden ending. Despite this, though, I was still somewhat interested in playing Part 2. I am still a video gamer after all. I was even theorizing as to what happened to the Fireflies, who was Ellie fighting, and why. Could it be true that Joel was nothing but a ghost in that teaser, and that Ellie was going on a rampage to avenge her father figure? Unfortunately, we still had a long road ahead of us before any of these questions were answered. The road to release would still be littered with controversy surrounding gay representation, crunch culture, and leaks. Massive, entire game-spoiling leaks. Now, we could have discussions involving those first two things with their own separate videos, but for the sake of this post and to keep focus, let's talk about the leaks, because this is where things got interesting for me. Gaming is often a hobby built upon consumption with minimal critique. Unlike physical art, film, or literature, gaming is quite black and white. Either the game is good, or it is not. The end. Rarely does a game's structure or story spark a lengthy discussion. There are only ever a handful of examples each generation that cause a real lasting discussion. A few examples from the past several years include Nier Automata, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and of course, Knack 2. So when I first heard about the leaks, my first reaction was, oh, that sucks for them. Then I noticed there was outrage over what was in those leaks. Not just a typical flash-in-the-pan anger either. It was heated, prolonged fury. This is when I said to myself, oh, this might actually end up being quite good, especially when I heard one certain idiom being uttered. Bait and switch. Now I have a certain soft spot when I hear those words because my favorite game of all time pulled it off. Masterfully, I might add, 2 decades ago in Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. It was highly controversial at the time, but its impact has risen to near mythic proportions since then, especially with the rise of the digital age, the game's main theme. That controversy ended up mattering in a huge way for how we anticipate games, play them, think about them, even how we approach our everyday life. After I heard bait and switch, I made sure to avoid any other potential leaks that might make their way to me. As someone who screams into the void over video games needing to be taken more seriously as an art form, I was fathoming what was going to be awaiting me in Part 2. In my few weeks of spoiler-free isolation, I quickly ordered Remastered on PS4 to replay it, and went through it on Grounded, the hardest difficulty mode, because I'm hardcore like that. I just really wanted to get into the brutality and hardships of the world because apparently I'm an idiot who thinks that the current world in which we live in is lacking those things. Once I got past the initial nerve-wracking opening, made even more traumatic with the ongoing world health crisis, I quickly found myself encapsulated in the overgrown hellscape of America in a way that I wasn't back in 2013. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed The Last of Us when it was released, but a lot of the praise had been lost on me. I thought it was a harrowing tale with one of the greatest endings in video game history, but overall, I was never truly in love with the game. 7 years later, though, it finally clicked. It's still the same dark, unforgiving environment with very normal people in it, an oddity for gaming. So what changed? Maybe it's maturity? Perhaps my brain has grown from its former crouton size and I'm able to appreciate things a little more? Maybe I played it under a different mindset than last time. I did suffer from hype burnout prior to its release. Or maybe it's because I was finally playing a game that placed heavy emphasis on stealth, my favorite genre that has all but been put into the grave. Whatever the reason, I was right in love with it, and that love was amplified by my first playthrough of the stellar Left Behind, which had to deal with its own controversy way back in 2014. I finished it all just days prior to the release of Part 2, and was still in the dark on the leaks people had known about for almost months now. I began to see the reviews talking about the extreme violence, the complicated nature of the game's characters, and the length of the overall product. The controversy was beginning to swell, and the discourse had truly begun. I was ready to dive in. The twists and turns that everyone can see coming a mile away are usually big, shocking moments to me. So when I took control of this buff chick named Abby, I had no clue what was happening. The moment she came across Joel and his brother Tommy, though, I had a feeling something was up, and when she got them back to her camp, I knew it was over. My heart sank when the members of the Washington Liberation Front, the WLF for short, surrounded the two brothers, and I had to look away as they blew off Joel's leg. My heart was now racing as I regained control of Ellie, knowing damn well that I was just gearing up to get a front row seat of a murder. When Abby snuffed out Joel's life with that golf club, it was agonizing and infuriating. Little did I know, that was one of the spoilers that caused so much uproar. It wasn't just that Joel was killed, but more so how he was killed. This baffles me because I thought it was done perfectly. It was a ruthless death in a pitiless world. You don't get to have a glorious send-off in the cordyceps-infected wasteland.
Please get up!
Look at the deaths we've seen up until this moment. Riley in Left Behind is bitten and turns. Sarah, Joel's daughter, is killed via gunshot by a soldier on Outbreak Day. Tess is bitten and then gunned down by soldiers. Frank, Bill's partner, hangs himself after becoming infected. Sam is bitten and turns. Henry commits suicide after killing his infected brother Sam. David is hacked to death by Ellie with a machete. Marlene is shot dead in a parking garage by Joel at the end of the first game. All these deaths are brutal and inglorious, with maybe the exception of Tess being a distraction for Joel and Ellie so they could escape. Even though Joel is one of the two biggest characters in the franchise, that doesn't make him immune to a cruel death. Personally, I felt it was extremely impactful because it was drawn out for some time, with his leg graphically being blown off first and then being repeatedly struck until death right in front of Ellie's eyes. It manages to capture the merciless nature of the world and initially fills the player with a fierce anger and need for revenge. Unfortunately, I do agree with a lot of people, though, that the message regarding that brutal revenge is almost immediately lost on the player when Ellie sets out on her killing quest. Naughty Dog does an excellent job of pumping you with bloodlust almost to instantly strip it away. Perhaps this says more about me as a person, but I didn't feel much emotion after planting a knife in just a few people's throats. It is extremely jarring and unnerving to see the animations unfold as you rip that blade across their Adam's apple or spray their brains on the curtains of an abandoned building. It's a technically impressive game, no doubt. I mean, God, look at those glass animations. And just like the Uncharted series, it needs that high level of visual detail to wrap the player up in its world and create that cinematic feel. The issue remains, though, that what Naughty Dog is trying to convey to the player through all this violence doesn't come across well, even when they try to give enemies specific names in hoping you'll feel remorse over your actions. The only time it has real impact is in key moments, like when you encounter Nora, one of the WLF members who helped kill Joel. You chase after her and corner her in a spore-laden part of a hospital. Ellie is drenched in a violent red light, and you're forced to commit the action of beating her to death. You can drag this out for as long as you want, which to me made it more impactful, but you'll still have to whack her upside the head no matter what. However, this moment suffers a setback. When Ellie returns to the movie theater hideout her and her girlfriend Dina are holing up in, she's bloody and bruised to all hell, and dryly gasps to Dina that she made Nora talk and almost bursts into tears. This scene would have had more weight to it if she hadn't just killed dozens on her path to get to Nora without a single drop of guilt. I thought that maybe perhaps it was because Nora was one of the soldiers that participated in Joel's death and thus had more meaning to Ellie than just the patrol troops. But she took Jordan down earlier in Seattle by stabbing him with her switchblade, and wasn't upset in the slightest. I think what Naughty Dog is trying to say here is that, at long last, Ellie is starting to feel the weight of all that she's done up to this point. She's almost totally losing her humanity. The only thing she has in life right now is the support of Dina, who is tenderly washing away her sins. In that moment, she begins to realize the emptiness of her quest, and that it may in the long run cost her even more than what she's already lost. That feeling, though, feels like I'm somewhat grasping at straws to defend Naughty Dog's vision. I feel Part 2's commentary on violence would have been more realized had they approached it in the way that the Dishonored games did with a chaos system. Depending on how you played the game, in terms of killing, quests and their outcomes would change. This gave the player a lot to think on during their playthrough. Man, Dishonored is so good. Go play those games, please. Part 2 gives you almost no choice but to kill. There are a few instances, like in the first game, where you can bypass rooms of enemies with minimal to zero death occurring. The game gives you more versatility to pull this off than the last game, thanks to being able to go prone and having more options at your disposal, like smoke bombs, silencers, and tall grass to hide in. Oh, you could also shatter glass to distract enemies. I just listed that so we could talk about the glass again. However, most of the time you still need to kill every enemy, or a good amount of them in the room, before you can pry that door open and move on. Imagine how much more impactful the scene with Nora would have been had Ellie's playstyle had influence on that scene. Make no mistake, it's all still very heavy, but could have been handled in a much more powerful way. Now, let's talk about that dreaded bait and switch. The biggest controversy surrounding Part 2 is that halfway through Ellie's Seattle slaying spree, you switch to the perspective of Joel's murderer, Abby. She comes to find Ellie after she murdered Abby's ex-lover and his pregnant girlfriend, which Ellie does seem upset about when it happens, albeit briefly. This is where I began to question if I was enjoying the game or not. Even though I had my qualms with all the violence, I was having a thoroughly good time. But now the game was going to have me repeat days in Seattle, but from the perspective of the supposed antagonist? It was bold and risky. This is something I've never seen a video game do. Not at great length, at least. Needless to say, I was worried. Almost immediately after the switch, we learn that the reason Abby murdered Joel is that her father was the head surgeon for the Fireflies. He was one of the 3 doctors in the room that were going to engineer the vaccine at the cost of Ellie's life. That is until Joel burst in and killed everyone in his selfish rescue quest. From the little time we get to spend with Abby's dad, Jerry, it's clear that he seems like a decently good human. He's a doctor, spends time with his daughter, is interested in her dating life, and even rescues zebras. All Joel did was show Ellie how to pet a stupid giraffe. There's even a scene where Jerry is talking with Marlene and he's stressing over the fact that he can't seem to get the brain samples needed for the vaccine without killing Ellie. Make no mistake, he places the importance of the vaccine and humankind over one person, but he still went through the tests to see if it would be possible to spare her life. That's normal doctor stuff, but given the situation of the world in this game, it's great to see that he apparently never lost his humanity. The same can't be said for his daughter Abby, however. During the time with her father, she seemed like a perfectly normal teen, spending time with her crush, eye-rolling at her dad, and shooting a plant monster or two right in the face. When she walks into that operating room, though, to see her father dead on the floor, her innocence and humanity are all but stripped away. In the months and years that follow that fateful day, she becomes distant, angry, and obsessed with tracking down Joel Miller. While not profoundly deep, Naughty Dog quickly manages to make you sympathetic towards Abby and her plight. Sure, actions have consequences, and there are two sides to every coin are not some sort of Stanley Kubrick or Ernest Hemingway level of profound meaning, but that still doesn't make the story less impactful. Even with a simple message, you can have an engaging and gut-wrenching tale. Thankfully, and unlike Ellie's story, Joel's death is in the past, and we can focus on who she is now. We see that she's established herself well within the higher soldier ranks of the WLF and has a nice home within the former stadium of the Seattle Seahawks. Also, we see why she's so buff. Must be nice to have an elite pro athlete gym during a pandemic. Whereas Ellie's quest is centered around one goal, Abby's storyline is a bit more ambiguous at first. Now that she's exacted her revenge, she's back to carrying out missions for the group at the behest of the WLF leader Isaac, acted by Jeffrey Wright, who is woefully underplayed, especially after you read about his rise to power and fighting against the Fedra soldiers in the notes spread throughout Seattle. The WLF is in a heavy battle against a group of religious fanatics called the Seraphites, or Scars for short. There was a peace treaty involving the two groups following the fall of the Fedra soldiers. It didn't last though, and the two have been biting back at each other ever since. Warring factions, particularly in a post-apocalyptic setting, is nothing new. Naughty Dog subverts expectations though, and has Abby, a sworn hater of Scars, coming across siblings named Yara and Lev after she's about to be strung up and gutted. The kids save her, and vice versa. Abby helps stabilize Yara after her arm is broken from the Seraphites, and leaves the two to get back on their own path. This is the first flash of selflessness we see from Abby. Up until this point, it's been nothing but pushing her on-again, off-again lover Owen away, both currently and in a few moments in the past, obsessing over finding Joel, and just being a ruthless and borderline thoughtless goose-stepper. Even after this moment, she gets into a fight with Owen and sleeps with him despite him being with a woman who is currently pregnant. Her priorities are lopsided, but they're about to be altered and set her back on the path of redemption. During her night with Owen, Abby has a nightmare about Lev and Yara being hunted down and killed. Abby can't live with that thought, so she goes out to find the two and help them get to safety. She finds the two and realizes that Yara's arm is beyond repair and will need medical assistance. So she takes the two back to the aquarium where Owen's girlfriend Mel needs medical supplies to perform an amputation. Despite knowing this will sound the alarms with Isaac and the WLF, Abby sets out with Lev to get the treatment needed. This is where part 2 mimics the first game. The game tried to somewhat do it early on with Ellie and Dina, but that was quickly pushed aside when Dina couldn't carry on due to her pregnancy. Instead of father and daughter though, like with Joel and Ellie, we get brother and sister with Lev and Abby. And instead of a father guiding his daughter in the ways of survival and brutality, we get a brother trying to help guide his sister back to the light. Like I mentioned earlier, at first I wasn't all about this. I thought the game was doing a mostly fine job of being tight and focused. Now it was becoming too large and out of control. But then Lev began to steal the show. In a game that's all about death, selfishness, and survival at any cost, it was a breath of fresh air to see a character who was not about any of those things. Sure, Lev killed when he needed to, but he never felt good about any of it. He even questions Abby when she takes down fellow WLF members near the end of their Seattle journey.
Abby, you killed those wolves.
There's clear humanity in the kid, when there probably shouldn't be. He lives in a world ravaged by a virus, shacks up with dictatorial zealots, and has recently discovered he's trans, which is why he's now labeled an apostate.
The apostate!
It's Lily!
This guy should be one of the most hardened, embittered souls in the game, but his goodness outweighs that pessimism. Lev even manages to keep his faith despite everything, choosing to hear the prophet's words over all the killing.
Protect them.
I wonder if your prophet had any idea what she was starting.
She saved dozens of people in ways no one can explain.
She blew up trucks and killed some soldiers. Not that hard to explain.
Have you read her writings?
Skimmed some.
You'd benefit from it.
Of course, he also has a few setbacks, like not understanding much of the outside world due to his life with the Seraphites.
Waiting on all that true strength.
Cold.
Cool.
What?
Never mind.
Together, he and Abby feed off each other and grow and learn. Abby manages to help Lev come out of his shell and discover who he is and the kind of boy he wants to be. Lev slowly begins to peel back Abby's defensiveness and gets her to understand a life outside of her own and begin to embrace those around her.
Come on.
Those were your fucking people.
You're my people.
This is the kind of humanity that I felt was sorely lacking in The Last of Us. Left Behind managed to add it in and right the ship, but that wasn't initially in the baseline experience. In Part 2, we get it in the core game, and when we least expect it too. I was prepared for a game that was dark and harsh and violent, and yeah, Part 2 is all of those things, but it's balanced as well, thanks to the inclusion of Lev. We especially see that humanity in Abby's final Seattle chapter. The war between the WLF and the Seraphites has reached its crescendo. The WLF has invaded the island the Seraphites call home, and the two begin their epic downfalls. During this time, Abby begins to stray from the WLF path. She sees what they are and finally begins to listen to Owen's pleas for heading down to Santa Barbara, where a rumor is being spread that the Fireflies are still around and he's looking to join back up. Lev and Yara want to go as well. Lev has grown too and knows that the Seraphites are no longer his family and the WLF won't take him, so it's time to start a new life with his new friends. Naively, though, he heads back to the Seraphite island to convince his devout mother to join them. This doesn't go well. Yara knows that their mom won't come and that Lev will most likely be caught in the middle of the fighting and die. Abby, along with Yara, then sets out in the middle of the war to rescue Lev. They find him hiding and scared with his mother dead on the ground next to him. Their disagreement led to an accident that caused her to be fatally wounded. With no time to dwell, Abby and Yara get Lev up and the three try to make it off the island. Before they can, though, Yara is fatally wounded by the WLF, but not before taking down their leader, Isaac. As fire and death rage around them, Abby and Lev make their way from the island and back to Owen and Mel. Upon arriving at the aquarium, Abby and Lev are greeted with Ellie's work. Abby has suffered yet again at the hands of Ellie and seeks to finish her off for good. Finding Ellie's Seattle map, her and Lev head to the movie theater to put an end to this bloody story. Now, I'm not a super emotional person. It takes a lot for me to be moved or feel anxious while playing a video game. I can analyze and appreciate it, but to feel is a whole different story. But let me tell you, when you're Abby heading to the movie theater to possibly kill Ellie, I almost felt sick to my stomach. I understand that Ellie isn't exactly deserving of forgiveness or even that likable, given everything we've seen her do up to this point. However, we've bonded with her and watched her grow, and now the game was maybe asking us to control someone else and kill her? It was so upsetting. But damn, did I love that feeling. Please, video games, put more stuff like this in future products. Ones that have you legitimately sweating, trembling, and having a hard time getting through emotionally. I could barely bring myself to get through the boss fight, and sometimes just opted to let Ellie kill me in hopes the game was meaning for that to happen. Thankfully, the boss battle ends in a stalemate. Abby, who in no way should forgive Ellie or let her go, does just that. Think about that. Here's a girl that has upended Abby's life twice now. She has every reason to just end Ellie's life right in that worn down movie theater. Yes, a lot of it is thanks to Lev's voice of reason pulling Abby back from the ledge. She's literally on the verge of replicating Ellie's actions from earlier by threatening to end Dina's life after killing Jesse and maiming Tommy. The only thing that makes this worse is that she's about to do it knowing full well that there's a baby inside her. This is where the relationship with Lev truly pays off for Abby and her redemption begins. We've seen hints of Abby's mindset changing, her abandonment of the WLF, seeking to be less jaded with Owen, and of course helping Lev and Yara to great extent. Had it not been for that help she decided to give and the bonds that formed from it, Abby would have fallen into the same pit of blind revenge that had plagued her for years following her father's death. Her newfound sibling managed to save her from completely losing herself. Perhaps it's naivety on Lev's part over the whole backstory with Ellie, but he's still aware of what she's done to his potential new friends in Mel and Owen. It's that goodness in him that we talked about earlier. He understands the horror of what's been done, but he refuses to sink along with the one who committed it. And that's beginning to rub off on Abby. Despite everything Ellie has done, Abby tells her to never cross her path again, and she leaves her in that movie theater. Abby knew if she had committed that crime, she would have lost the last thing in her life, Lev. Ellie has that same chance at redemption too, having been left with a still alive and pregnant Dina. In the most painful way though, she ultimately doesn't take it, and thus reveals herself to be the true villain. We're transported to about 2 years in the future after having left Seattle. Dina and Ellie are now moms on a ranch somewhere outside the city of Jackson, Wyoming, where our tale began. Earlier in the game, Dina had mentioned wanting to live on a farm, away from the hustle and bustle of Jackson. She got that. Plus Ellie and her newborn son, JJ. Even in a world decimated by infection, a life suffocating in agony and loss, there is stability and order. Sadly, this peaceful life is ruined by Ellie. She continues to have PTSD flashbacks of Joel's death and is haunting her day and night. To make matters worse, Tommy comes to the house one day and tells Ellie that he's got a lead on Abby. Initially, she resists, claiming that she's no longer concerned with getting her revenge, but her and the audience both know this is a lie. She doesn't even hold out for a day before packing up her things and setting out to follow the lead. Dina begs her to stay, claiming that she doesn't need to go, and if Ellie truly loves her, like she says she does, she'll stay. Ellie listens to Dina's pleas, but her selfishness reigns supreme. Despite having the best life you could probably ask for in that world, Ellie throws it all away to chase a rumor and finish her revenge. She's lost so much up to this point. Her mom, the Fireflies, Joel, and her life's purpose. She's also managed to gain so much though, but it doesn't matter at all to her. She then sets out to complete her downfall. Meanwhile, we see Abby and Lev chasing a rumor of their own, but with a totally different mentality. They've gone all the way down to Santa Barbara in hopes of finding the Fireflies and finding purpose in their lives again. They look happy, even though they're having trouble finding what they're looking for. Abby is upbeat and shedding her cynicism of the past, and Lev is growing out his hair, sporting some new digs, and discovering the world outside of the Seraphites. They keep the state of the world in their minds, but they don't seem burdened by their past. And now I know that not everyone gets PTSD after a traumatic experience, and it affects everyone differently. But that doesn't change the fact that they've both lost heavily like Ellie has. The key difference here, though, is that they choose not to let that trauma consume them and manifest into anger and malice. Abby and Lev eventually find what they're looking for. They manage to radio the Fireflies, who are now stationed solely on Catalina Island, trying to rebuild their numbers. It's a beautiful moment in a grim game.
Hi, Abby. We got a clear signal on you. Where in Santa Barbara are you calling from?
2425 Constance.
It fills you with hope, not just for the characters at hand, but for the world. They're restarting with a small group and hopefully one day can save humanity like they were initially trying to do. Like all things in The Last of Us, though, this is short-lived and the two are immediately knocked out by a local gang that looks like they just got back from a Metallica concert. A few months later, Ellie arrives in Santa Barbara to find Abby. She quickly works her way through the Rattlers, that Metallica gang from earlier. I've seen a lot of people complain that this last section of the game is where the game is simply too long. Not the Santa Barbara part itself, but this last bit being added on feels like it's being dragged out. I personally didn't feel that way. Yeah, the game is long and could maybe use a few pacing corrections, but for the story to wrap up sooner would have felt rushed to me. After Ellie clears the Rattlers, she comes across prisoners that they've been keeping and helps free them. They point her on the path to Abby, who along with Lev has been taken to the beaches where they're both strung up and starved. Before I get into this part though, let me mention that I just absolutely love the attention to detail here. I know it came at great cost, what with crunch culture and all, but Abby being almost unrecognizable and emaciated was such a nice touch that video games rarely apply. Okay, let's get back to the final showdown. Here is where I would have been okay with the game ending. Ellie cuts Abby down along with Lev and realizes that she's suffered enough. To kill her now in this weakened state isn't worth it. We've seen both sides, we've seen what they've done, and we've seen what they've lost. We're content at letting Abby go. But Ellie is not. Right before Ellie is about to get in her boat and drive away, she has a quick flash of Joel's death and lets that death consume her one final time. She tells Abby that she can't let her go, and that she needs to finish it. Abby refuses, but ultimately complies after Ellie threatens to kill Lev, who's unconscious in the boat. I know some have voiced their displeasure at this scene. They say that this scene shows her to be an absolute monster concerned with only one thing: revenge. I agree with both of those things, and while I think that the moment where she truly loses sympathy is when she abandons Dina and JJ, I don't think this scene is done poorly. I think it solidifies that Ellie is no longer decent, and someone we should not be rooting for. I thought the scene really hammers it home well. Ellie and Abby then fight one last time. It's a vicious brawl that is made just so much more emotional thanks to Gustavo Santaolall's incredible score. Much in the way that the first game in the movie theater had my heart racing, this last encounter was doing that even more so. For one, I knew that this was the end of this unforgettable game. I also wasn't sure what was going to happen, and even with Ellie deserving little to no sympathy, I found myself in that moment dreading her winding up dead in the shallow waters of Santa Barbara. I was also feeling the same over having to kill Abby. Ellie could have just let her go and that would have been satisfying. Now we might have to drive the switchblade into her heart. It was a lot to handle. That switchblade does end up piercing Abby's chest, but it's not what defeats her. Broken down and beaten, Abby finds herself pinned under Ellie and struggles to avoid being drowned. Thankfully, you aren't asked to mash the square button to keep her submerged until she's dead, but you're forced to look on as Ellie begins to do the questionable act of ending Abby's life. As I sat there, I'm sure my feelings weren't too different from yours, and that this didn't seem like the right thing, and that Ellie would see the light at the last moment. Just as she's about to avenge Joel's death, Ellie has one last flashback. This time, however, it isn't about Joel's death, but a quick flash of him sitting outside on his final night alive, playing his guitar. She sees it in her mind, and her grip on Abby loosens. She falls back into the water and tells Abby to go and take Lev. Ellie sits there nursing her mangled fingers that Abby has basically bitten off, and she watches as her last lifeline to Joel's murder drives away into the fog, and she thinks back on that last night they were together. Ellie confronts Joel for having stepped in to help break up a potential argument Ellie and Dina were having with one of Jackson's residents, Seth, over their first kiss. Ellie can't stand Joel's constant smothering, from defending her that night at the dance, to badgering people like Jesse over her patrols of the town. She can't escape him and still harbors deep resentment for him having cost her life mattering way back at that hospital years ago. She knows that he has made her life so difficult, and that he is not truly deserving of forgiveness and respect, but can't bring herself to hate him in the end. Throughout Ellie's story, we have a few flashbacks, all relating to her relationship with Joel. We see them quickly posted in Jackson following the events of the first game, and him promising to teach her guitar. Or, as he says it, guitar. We're also transported to a scene later in the game, personally my favorite, where Joel takes Ellie to a science museum for her birthday, featuring dinosaurs and space exploration. We can feel the wonderment through Ellie here, as she gets to explore the age of the reptiles and even blasts off to space thanks to real audio from the Apollo 11 launch.
30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
It was just such a wonderful moment getting to envision humanity at its best, in a world and a story where they're at their worst. As these flashbacks go on, though, the bond between the two starts to weaken. We've seen great moments of connection, but Ellie can't shake what happened in that hospital so many years ago. She chose to believe Joel that day about her immunity not mattering, but knew deep down it wasn't the truth. Not before long, she heads back to St. Mary's Hospital in Salt Lake and uncovers an old recording detailing how the Fireflies have fallen apart and that she was the miracle child that got away and that a cure seemed all but gone now. She then forces Joel to admit the truth to her. Finally, he comes clean and admits what he did. Overcome with pressure and grief, she announces the relationship between the two as dead.
I'll go back. But we're done.
Clearly, it wasn't. Though strained, Ellie still had a deep love for Joel. On that last night together before they parted, she says she doesn't think she can ever forgive him for what he did that day, but that she would like to try. It's the memory of that night and that final moment of the conversation where Ellie knows she needs to let Abby go. The only way she can truly begin to try and forgive Joel is by letting him go, and by doing that, she needs to let his killer go. People have argued that Part 2 paints Joel in a negative light, that his character arc from the first game is ruined and his death achieves nothing, aside from setting up Ellie's story in the sequel. The complaint I have with this argument is that Joel was not a good guy in the first one. The ending is so powerful because he does such a selfish thing and potentially costs humanity's resurrection. There's no way of framing that in a positive light. We know the choices he's made even prior to saving Ellie from death. Your choices have consequences, especially in that world. His past catches up with him and he meets his fate. Even he's ready for it after Abby shoots him. I don't see it as a mere plot device. In fact, I think it helps to strengthen the relationship between Ellie and Joel in the long run. Overall, though, Part 2 is a messy tale that can be frustrating throughout, particularly in its ending. A lot of people have quoted Ellie from the end of the first game.
We don't have to do this. You know that, right?
What's the other option?
Go back to Tommy's. Just be done with this whole damn thing.
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
Unfortunately, it largely was. She let revenge slip through at the very end, much in the way that Joel let the meaning of the first game slip through, but in a much sloppier way, one that betrays the fans at the last possible moment. We actually get to see Abby turn herself around and get away. But at the end of the day, this isn't her game. It's Ellie's. Ellie seemingly doesn't get to turn things around. At least not anything we see. She heads back to the farm to see that Dina and JJ have left. The whole house is empty, save for Ellie's art room. She finds her guitar and tries to play, but can't hit certain notes thanks to her now missing fingers, the final piece of her relationship with Joel being severed. She's truly lost it all. In the game's final scene, we see her put the guitar up against the windowsill and leave the farm, her destination unknown. Maybe she's heading somewhere new, getting away from Tommy and everything she's ever known. Perhaps she's heading back to Jackson to start her life over, seeking the forgiveness of Dina, and truly beginning to grow. It isn't an easy ending to swallow by any means. We're left a lot like Ellie in the water, upset, confused, empty. Did everything we just play end up not mattering? I've struggled a lot with this ending. I've played the game twice, and I'm still not sure how to take it in. I get why fans are upset. It's totally understandable, but part of me enjoys not being satisfied. I love that the story doesn't give you what you want, even if it might harm itself in doing so. I'm a firm believer that not every story has to have a clean-cut ending, good or bad. It can be open-ended and raw. You don't always have to have a definitive opinion on a game either. Part 2 doesn't hit every note it's going for. And like we went over previously, it doesn't offer the most complex messaging. But I appreciate the risks Naughty Dog took, and I feel, for the most part, they pay off decently well. They weren't afraid to pull that character switch on us, have us sympathize with Joel's murderer, and paint Ellie as the villain. They didn't shy away from having us feel the ramifications of Joel's selfish actions at the end of the first game. Perhaps the story would have been better had it remained a singular narrative with the original game. For a good portion of us, our fears had come to pass in that the first story would be tainted. I don't blame anybody for thinking that way, and I had to share that sentiment a bit. But looking back after my second playthrough, I'm very glad the game exists. I know the discourse around Part 2 is quite toxic. It's hard to have an opinion without being shouted down or simply dismissed. My hope, though, is that this game will help the medium strive to a new level of debate and discussion. Right now, it's just a hotbed of controversy. But there's a saying that, if it matters, it produces controversy. I'm hoping that The Last of Us Part 2 matters. Hello everyone! I hope you enjoyed my video review on The Last of Us Part 2. I had a lot of fun putting it together, even though it was a lot of hard work. It was really my first ever in-depth critique review for YouTube. What with all of the video recording, the voice recording, the editing, I actually had to play the game a third time. So playing it 3 times in a row was kind of exhausting, but I still had a great time. And I'd appreciate any sort of feedback because of that down below in the comments. I will be engaged with what you're saying, most definitely. And even if you have something just to say on the game as well, I'll definitely be interested in reading that, as long as both of those points are, well thought out. But if you're looking forward to more content, don't worry, I have you covered. I'll be doing in-depth critiques reviews like this probably once a month. I have my next video planned, which will be on the PS4 exclusive Ghost of Tsushima. So definitely look forward to that. It'll probably be out around this time next month. But in between that, I'm also going to have other videos coming out too. Just some things like list videos. So, top 5 scariest games, top 5 most underrated games of the generation. So things like that. I'll also have new stuff, games that I picked up on Amazon, eBay, at a local game store, and that I'm going to be adding to my collection. Don't know which way to point. So, games that mean a lot to me, things that I want to add to my collection in terms of like my favorite franchises, whatnot. I'm also going to be having some stream highlights that I'll be posting once a week as well. I'll be streaming on Twitch this week, starting Wednesday, and it'll be going 5 days a week. So this week it'll be Wednesday through Sunday, about late morning to early mid-afternoon. I'll definitely have the schedule posted on my Twitch page, and you can follow me there. I'd really appreciate that. I'd also appreciate you subscribing to my channel here and liking this video, just to help me get started with my YouTube channel. But yeah, that'll pretty much do it for me. Once again, I hope you enjoyed everything, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.